Welcome back to your news bulletin. We start from China, where the number of deaths from new coronavirus has risen to 722, passing the death toll from the SARS outbreak in 2003. China's National Health Commission says the number of confirmed infections in the country has risen to over 34,000. More in this report.
The number of casualties is the highest recorded in a day, including the first US and Japanese citizens. In Japan, the health ministry says 3 more people have tested positive for coronavirus on a quarantined cruise ship anchored at Yokohama. It brings the country's total number of cases to 64. In the United States, hundreds of people evacuated from Wuhan have begun arriving at military bases across the country to begin a 2-week quarantine.
In China, they're in mitigation stages. Okay, that we're really they're really now beyond containment. The virus right now is not under control in China. In the United States, I think the multi-layer system that we've put out is still got us in a mode of containment.
Despite President Trump's praise for China, Washington has once again expressed concern about how the outbreak is being managed.
Moving on to the U.S., where President Donald Trump has dismissed 2 senior officials who testified against him at his impeachment trial. The fired officials are U.S. envoy to the EU, Gordon Sondland, and National Security Council member Alexander Windman. During the impeachment hearing, Sondland admitted following the president's orders to press for a quid pro quo deal with Ukraine. He said Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's White House visit was conditional on the investigating former Vice President Joe Biden. Windman testified he was concerned when hearing Trump's phone call with President Zelensky. Earlier, Trump called on Congress to expugn his impeachment for abuse of power after his acquittal in the Senate. Russia has pledged to boost military and economic cooperation with Venezuela despite growing U.S. pressure. After meeting his Venezuelan counterpart in Caracas, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov called attempts to remove President Maduro by force unacceptable. The U.S. accuses Maduro of leading a corrupt and brutal regime. Yesterday, Washington imposed sanctions on Venezuela's state-run airline Conviasa over shuttling corrupt officials. The U.S. backs opposition leader Juan Guaido, who declared himself the country's interim president. Russia is Venezuela's key ally, lending billions of dollars, despite years of hyperinflation and the exodus of 5 million people.
We wholeheartedly condemn blackmail, sanctions, and other measures that go against the Charter of the United Nations, and this includes military intervention in sovereign nations.
In Sochi, Russia President Vladimir Putin has met with Belarus counterpart Alexander Lukashenko amid oil row between the 2 countries. The row, which is in its 2nd month, has forced Minsk to look for crude from as far afield as the U.S. More in this report.
Belarus is a major export route for Moscow's oil and gas to Europe. Putin wants to keep Minsk in his orbit, and Lukashenko was for years getting cheap resources and loans in exchange. For Moscow, supporting Minsk costs a couple of $1 billion per year, so it has started to gradually change the way it taxes its oil industry. The changes, in turn, are hurting the Belarus budget. With Belarus presidential elections approaching this year, Lukashenko refused to sign a new oil deal with Russia. From January 1st, Moscow has almost completely halted oil supplies to Minsk. Oil exports to Europe have so far been stable.
Pakistan's Foreign Office has rejected Indian leadership's anti-Pakistan rhetoric as an attempt to divert attention from the crisis in Kashmir. In a statement, the Foreign Office said Indian government's extremist ideology is jeopardizing regional peace. It said the Hindutva ideology is responsible for discrimination against Indian minorities. The Foreign Office also rejected allegations of mistreatment of minorities in Pakistan. It urged the international community to hold India responsible for its illegal actions in the occupied valley. In India, voting is underway in 70 constituencies of Delhi's State Assembly. The ruling Bharatiya Janata Party is contesting under severe criticism of the controversial Citizenship Act. The Indian Election Commission has identified 516 locations and 3,704 polling booths as critical voting stations. Paramilitary forces have been deployed in the constituencies to ensure smooth elections. Delhi, like much of the rest of the country, has been a hotbed of protests since December when BJP imposed the discriminatory law. Prime Minister Narendra Modi won national elections in last May, but the capital's Legislative Assembly is also pivotal for his policies' implementation. Moving on to Palestine, where the Health Ministry says the Israelis have shot dead another Palestinian during clashes in the occupied West Bank. 19-year-old Badr Nafla is the fifth Palestinian killed by Israeli troops in the last 2 days. In a statement, the ministry said Israeli occupation forces opened fire at Nafla in the village of Khafin. It said a live shot hit his neck, which injured him critically. He later succumbed to his wounds in a nearby hospital. The escalation came days after US President Donald Trump unveiled his Middle East peace plan, which has been rejected by the Palestinians. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, 8 people have been killed in a series of attacks by rebels belonging to the Allied Democratic Forces. Police say 20 other civilians are missing after the attack in the Mangenia area of Beni. Officials said they don't know if the missing people are dead, taken hostages, or if they fled the area. Last week, 24 people were killed in an ADF attack in North Kivu province. Over 300 civilians have died in rebel attacks since Congo's forces launched an offensive against armed groups in Beni last October. France says it has killed 30 militants in Mali. In a statement, the French military said militants were targeted in 3 different operations over the past 2 days. It said the operations targeted Al-Qaeda and ISIS-linked groups. In November last year, 13 French soldiers were killed in a helicopter crash during an operation in northern Mali. It was the heaviest single loss for the French military in nearly 40 years. France currently has more than 4,500 troops fighting insurgencies in the sparsely populated Sahel region. The area has been repeatedly seeing clashes between militants and local forces. France's President Emmanuel Macron has warned that European countries cannot remain spectators in any new arms race. Talking to military officers in Paris, Macron said the EU must play a direct role to stop nuclear proliferation. He said France has already reduced the number of its warheads to under 300. With the UK's official departure from the EU, France is now the only nuclear power in the bloc. Britain's ambassador to Iran is back in Tehran weeks after he returned to London following his brief arrest by Iranian security forces last month. Rob McCrae was arrested after authorities accused him of attending an illegal anti-government protest in Tehran. The ambassador denied and said he had attended a vigil for the crash victims. The British government has termed his detention a violation of diplomatic conventions. His departure had fueled speculations that he may not come back. However, in a message on social media, the ambassador said his trip to London was planned some time ago. A British woman who was a teenager ran away to join ISIS has lost a legal challenge she hoped would restore her UK citizenship. Britain's Special Immigration Appeals Commission has ruled Shamima Begum was not improperly deprived of her nationality. This means she cannot return to London. Former Home Secretary Sajid Javed revoked her citizenship on national security grounds, but she challenged the decision. Legal experts have criticized Javed's move, saying it left Begum stateless. Media reports suggest the action was taken on the grounds she could obtain a Bangladeshi passport. While Begum's parents are of Bangladeshi origin, she does not hold a passport from the country. Malaysia says it will repatriate more than 200 diplomats, officials and their families from mainland China, Hong Kong and Taiwan. Kuala Lumpur said some of them already returned to the country yesterday. The Foreign Ministry said the safety measure was taken after consultations with Chinese authorities. Meanwhile, Australia is sending a second chartered flight to evacuate its citizens. Prime Minister Scott Morrison said passengers on the flight back from Wuhan will be quarantined on the Australian mainland. We have a lot more coming up right after this short break, so stay tuned. Welcome back. The Philippines has announced it is ending an important military agreement with the U.S. In a statement, the presidential spokesperson said Washington will soon be notified of Manila's decision. Last week, President Duterte said he would scrap the agreement allowing U.S. forces to take part in large-scale military exercises in the country. The agreement was signed in 1998, giving legal status to thousands of U.S. troops rotated into the country for military exercises and humanitarian operations. In Australia, severe weather warnings have been issued as floods are expected to hit the country's coastal areas of New South Wales. The Meteorological Bureau said the eastern state will suffer heavy downpours, calming the region's bushfire crisis. The Bureau has warned of dangerous flood conditions for this weekend. The Met Department said yesterday was the wettest day recorded in Sydney for over a year. The inundation closed roads and disrupted public transport. The NSW Fire Service says the rains have put out a third of the fires in the region, but 43 blazes are still burning. Botswana has held its first auction of elephant hunting licenses since it lifted a ban last year. The southern African country has 130,000 elephants, the largest population in the world. The government has already sold 7 hunting licenses. Each one allows a hunter to kill 10 elephants in controlled areas. Officials say hunting is necessary to ease the conflict between animals and humans. Lifting the ban has been popular with many farmers, but has been heavily criticized by conservationists. In London, the wildlife and culture of Indonesia is a big feature at Kew Gardens' 25th annual Orchid Festival, which has just opened. An archipelago of 17,000 islands, Indonesia's flora and fauna are as diverse as its landscape. This report has some stunning flower arrangements.
Cascading flower displays, a central glasshouse pond, and an erupting orchid volcano have transformed the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew into a dreamland. The sun has turned this part of London into a paradise, all for this year's Kew Orchid Festival. Visitors are charmed by a display of 5,000 orchids and hundreds of tropical plants.
I think it's really nice, it's really pretty. It's nice that they're representing different countries and they're showing biodiversity. I think it's really important because so much climate change, deforestation, so it's good to see some effort to conserve wildlife.
It's stunning. I come every year. I come for 2 reasons. I come to see the English spring flowers, the snowdrops, the crocuses.
Festival scientists hope to find new plants and to help conserve Indonesia's biodiversity.
So the Orchid Festival is in its 25th year at Kew, and the theme this year is Indonesia. We're focusing on the beautiful natural abundance of Indonesia as a country and a series of many islands, and using that to really showcase Kew science stories and the beautiful, amazing work that our horticulturalists can actually create.
The festival runs until March 8th.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin says the country's GDP growth for the year 2020 is expected to be under 3%. Mnuchin says growth will miss President Donald Trump's target, with Boeing's suspension of production taking a bite out of the economy. He said Boeing has had a big impact on U.S. trade, with the plane maker being the country's largest exporter. Mnuchin said the coronavirus will also upset the economy because it negatively affects global growth. The US economy grew by 2% in 2019, its slowest expansion in 3 years. Now let's look at the weather from around the globe. This is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news.